Hey guys, this is Jake at That Fit Friend, and today I'm going to be covering my 5 all-time favorite deadlift tips in 10 minutes. Let's go. My first tip, and this is arguably what I would say is the most important tip for literally anybody in the deadlift who wants to improve their one arm strength, general strength, their form, their strength off the floor, is resetting every single rep versus doing touch and go deadlifts. Now, this is not me shaming touch and go deadlifts. I think there is a time and place for them. However, I think for the vast majority of lifters and athletes that want to improve their just general deadlift strength or their form, resetting every rep will give you a slightly better means of doing so. So why do I not like touch and go deadlifts for most lifters and athletes? So when we're doing touch and go deadlifts, we're getting momentum off the floor to create vertical displacement. Now, if you're doing high rep sets or you're like practicing for CrossFit where you are gonna have a lot of high volume deadlifts programmed in your WODs, that's a whole different case, and that's where it can be useful. However, if you wanna make sure that you are really building a dynamite pull that is kind of bulletproof when it comes to fatigue setting in and whatnot, resetting your deadlift can be an incredible tool because when you reset every single rep, you're gonna need to produce more effort because you are starting from a dead stop position. And when you're working with higher thresholds, this can be incredibly useful because as fatigue starts to set in your sets, you can start to see how your form changes. Whereas if you're doing touch and go deadlifts with that same threshold, you might not notice that because with that momentum, you can sometimes mask how your form changes when fatigue is starting to set in. So let's say we're doing a heavy triple and by that third rep, we're starting to have our hips shoot up because we're getting more tired. That is awesome data because, okay, now as a lifter, I know once fatigue hits this point with this threshold, I have to either cue myself a certain way or I can then get more specific with my programming and build a block where I'm starting to try to eliminate this problem from happening as that fatigue sets in. So once again, there's a ton of benefit in resetting your deadlifts every single rep, and I would highly encourage every lifter and athlete to reset every single deadlift rep if you're trying to improve your 1RM strength, your relative strength, or just your form in general. Touch and go have their time and place, but for most lifters and athletes, I think resetting every single rep is gonna be one of the best tools you can use for your growth, but granted, it's gonna be tough, so buckle up. My second tip is for anybody who wants to improve their grip strength in the deadlifts. Now, how I approach this topic is to keep it very specific to the deadlift and then also not change a ton of variables with your current program. So what I mean by that is that as you're doing your warm-up sets, try to pull double overhand for as long as you can, and while it's still manageable, do like an extra 1 or 2 seconds on each rep at lockout holding that weight and just building the tolerance of your ability to hold that weight for a little bit longer. It's a nice sneaky way to add a little bit more volume with a double overhand grip, which will carry over to deadlift strength, and you don't have to change anything. Also, as you're warming up, outside of adding like 1 to 2 seconds at lockout holding that weight, try to get a little bit heavier with the weight you can do a double overhand grip with until you have to switch to your mixed grip or hook grip or straps, whatever you might be using. These are 2 sneaky ways to improve your deadlift grip strength without adding a ton of carries, a ton of dead hangs and stuff to your program, which you might not have the capability to do without having to shift other things around. So it's a sneaky way to keep your grip strength specific to the deadlift and to build stronger strength without changing too much shit. And if you want to go ham, you could program a full double overhand block. I've done that before for like a 6-week block. Now your deadlift pulls are not going to be as heavy as they normally are, but you're using your grip as your limiter. So that can be a really nice sneaky tool to also build up your grip strength if you want to be a little bit sadistic and program a full-on double overhand grip block to improve your deadlift grip strength. My third tip is to slow the F down. Now, if you're pulling for velocity and power, this does not apply to you, but I think for the vast majority of lifters and athletes, there is power and slowness with the deadlift. The deadlift is a concentric focused lift, and I think as weight starts to get heavier and as we start to move slower, lifters and athletes can have the tendency to kind of freak out and either change their form drastically or drop the weight because they're moving slower than they're used to and they're just not used to like kind of staying in it and fighting that deadlift. So a tip that I would implore to any lifter who notices that they start to freak out mentally when things get heavier and they start to move slower or that their form starts to change is to add a 2 to 3 second tempo in their deadlift. So you could do this for a block, you could do this for certain intensities where you notice the form starts to change, for example. But why I like programming a concentric tempo in the deadlift is because it almost trains us to be comfortable moving slow. So let's say we're pulling like heavier doubles, triples, or even singles. If we program a purposely slow concentric, we can kind of get in our head, okay, I'm gonna pull this a little bit slower. I can focus on where my form starts to change, which can then give us data. But more importantly, it kind of like drills in our head, hey, this is gonna move slow. I'm purposely moving slow. I'm gonna stay in this, I'm gonna fight this rep. And I think that's an incredibly powerful tool that constantly gets overlooked. And that's why we see deadlifts with like the hips shooting up, or we see rush deadlifts where tension is lost before the pull even starts. By slowing down, we can kind of mitigate all of that and get comfortable when things get hard and when they get heavy. My fourth tip is for beginners, and more specifically, beginners who feel like their deadlift form is inconsistent week to week. And so what I would ask this beginner is, how many times a week are you deadlifting? If it is only once, increase your frequency. It is super simple, but constantly overlooked. And I think at times the fitness industry can be like, oh no, you can't deadlift more than once a week, the nervous system, blah, blah, blah. Like, your nervous system is going to be fine. Work with a coach, have a good, well-rounded program, and you'll be okay. So by increasing your frequency, you're getting more exposure to the movement. The deadlift is a skill, and if you want to learn the deadlift sooner than later, if you're only deadlifting once a week, and let's say you take a week off or two throughout the year, you're deadlifting what, 50, 52 times a year? If you increase your frequency to 2 times a week, that now changes from 52 to 104 times. That is a very big difference. And when it comes to increasing your frequency, an awesome tool that you can use is then varying your deadlift days and their focuses. So you can have a day, for example, that is more skill focused. You could focus on tempo, pauses, etc. And then you could have a day where you're focusing more on strength. So you get this nice blend of exposures to create this nice harmonious, really well-rounded deadlift. So if you're only deadlifting once a week and you want to improve your deadlift and you are trying to get more specific with your pulling, increase your frequency. It is super simple, but often overlooked. My fifth tip revolves around 2 whack cues that I don't think anybody should really be using, because I think they're cues often used for beginners, but then outside of that context, they really don't serve a purpose. And those 2 cues are keep your weight in your heels and retract the scaps. Why do I hate keep your weight in your heels? Well, for starters, when you are initiating your deadlift off the floor, the quads are gonna be highly active. If we keep the weight in our heels, we're not gonna be able to use our quads to help extend the knee, which is gonna be a huge player in how we initiate the movement of the deadlift. So what I would encourage instead is either maintain a tripod foot position, maintain contact with that big toe into the ground, or just drive through the ground with the quads as you lift, or push into the ground. Those are all better cues than keep the weight in the heels, because if you keep your weight in your heels, I think you are under leveraging your quads, which can be incredibly useful when popping that weight off the floor. The other cue that I don't like is retract the scaps or set the scaps. The reason I don't like this is because when we think about the deadlift, it's a flexion biased movement. As weight gets heavier, there will always be some degree of flexion happening at the back. We're not gonna be able to pull 1RMs with a highly extended back. That's just not how it works. And so when we're setting for the deadlift and we're thinking retract the scaps, what ends up happening? We end up shortening our arm length, which can be incredible tools in the deadlift, and we're putting our mid to upper back into more extension. And now as weight starts to get heavier, if we're extended here, there will come a threshold to where this can't maintain positioning, and that's gonna pull you then into flexion. And that greater degree of variance, that's where things can get a little bit hairy in certain contexts. So instead, what I would encourage you to do is, instead of thinking retract the scaps, just use the arms as hooks. Let them just hang. Your scaps, your lats, all of this musculature up here are going to keep your arms in place. And if we can keep our arms as long as possible, that is going to help us be more efficient with our deadlift. And as you start to get more advanced with your deadlift too, there's power in understanding, okay, how can I actually get a little bit more mid to upper flexion of the back to get more out of my pull? And now that is a more advanced technique topic for another day, but there is a ton of power in that. And if you're retracting the scaps before you start your deadlift, I think you're leaving gains on the table, because you're manipulating your position to not be as mechanically efficient as possible with your deadlift. It's similar to weight in the heels, where it's just like, okay, cool, but like why? Outside of teaching a beginner how to deadlift who just needs to hear that because they're like too forward or they're too protracted, where does it really make sense for the vast majority of lifters and athletes? All right, y'all, hopefully you're able to take something away from this video. This video idea was actually inspired by a conversation I had with my training partner last week about some of the best pieces of advice we had ever received with our deadlift in our lifting career. So I'm hoping that you're able to take at least one of these tips and apply it to your context. But as always, if you have additional questions, drop a comment down below or reach out to me personally, whichever you prefer. And as always, drop a like on the video, drop a subscribe to the channel. Peace.